On June 25, 2009, when the paramedics arrived at the house on North Carrollwood Drive, and the autopsy was eventually completed, the single detail that disturbed the medical examiners most was not the propofol in his system. It was something far more basic, far more human, far more heartbreaking. His stomach was completely empty, not partially empty, not lightly eaten from, completely empty, containing nothing except partially dissolved medication. The man, who had just spent weeks rehearsing one of the most physically demanding concert residencies in the history of live performance, had essentially nothing in his body when his heart stopped. He weighed 136 pounds. He was 5 feet 9 inches tall. That number, that empty stomach, that is where this story actually begins. Not with propofol, not with Conrad Murray, not with the This Is It rehearsals. It begins decades earlier with a little boy who loved fried chicken and how the most powerful entertainment machine ever built slowly and completely changed his relationship with his own body until there was almost nothing left. This is the story most coverage of Michael Jackson never tells completely. The story of what he ate, what he refused to eat, what his body was doing while the world was watching his feet. And how 4 decades of a complicated and ultimately destructive relationship with food contributed to the tragedy that the autopsy report documented in language that is clinical but impossible to read without grief. Begin in Gary, Indiana, because that is where everything starts. Michael Jackson, as a small child, was round-cheeked and energetic and ate the way children eat when food is uncomplicated. His mother, Catherine, prepared meals for 9 children in a house that was too small for the family it contained. By her own account, Michael at home in those early years was normal. He ate, he played. He shot basketballs with his brothers in the driveway. He was a child. Then the Jackson 5 started touring and the normal ended. The road schedule of a touring act in the late 1960s and early 1970s was not designed around nutrition or rest or the biological needs of children who were still growing. It was designed around performances and logistics and getting to the next city. The Jackson brothers ate what was available when they could get it: fast food, fried chicken, sugary things from vending machines and convenience stores in whatever city they happened to be passing through. Michael's longtime friend David Guest would remember those years later with the specific affection people have for memories that were happy before they understood what was coming. He would recall Michael happily eating fried chicken in the back of a car, peeling the crispy skin off carefully and announcing with genuine delight that he had made it organic and could eat it now. There was real joy in that image, a kid on tour who found a way to make junk food feel like an accomplishment. But the seeds of something more complicated were already being planted alongside that joy. The stage is a specific kind of pressure that does not exist anywhere else in the world. It requires you to look a certain way under lights that show everything. It requires you to move in ways that demand a specific body. And it requires you to receive the judgment of audiences and critics and the people responsible for your career, while you are still young enough that their opinions become the lens through which you see yourself. Michael Jackson started receiving that judgment before he was old enough to drive. The comments about his weight, the comments about his appearance, the expectations about what the world's most famous child performer should look like. These things landed in a developing psychology that was simultaneously exceptional and vulnerable, in the way that all extraordinary children are vulnerable. He absorbed them, he filed them, and eventually he acted on them. The shift happened in the early 1980s as he prepared for Thriller. He had already released Off the Wall and understood at some cellular level that what came next had to be bigger, had to be more, had to be perfect in a way that Off the Wall had not been. And part of that perfection in his mind was physical. He wanted the body of a dancer, not a pop star, a dancer, lean and angular and capable of movements that looked impossible from the audience. He believed that a body with no excess softness would allow him to move in ways that a heavier body could not. He became a strict vegetarian. He eliminated alcohol. He eliminated anything that he felt compromised the purity of what he was building. He was meticulous, and he was disciplined, and he was genuinely motivated by a vision of performance that was unlike anything anyone had attempted in popular music. The contradictions were visible almost immediately to the people around him. He signed one of the most lucrative endorsement deals in advertising history with Pepsi-Cola. He appeared in commercials smiling alongside the product with the full warmth and charm that only he could project. Those closest to him later disclosed that he never actually drank Pepsi, never put it in his body. He had reportedly told a close associate with a mixture of amusement and something darker that they paid him millions to sell something he would never put in his own body. Whether that quote is precise or has been softened or sharpened by the years since it circulated, it captured something true about how he operated. He understood the commercial machine he was part of. He participated in it fully when it served his purposes, and he maintained private lines that the machine could not cross. What he put in his body was one of those lines. Katherine Jackson watched the transformation with the specific anxiety of a mother who understands that something is wrong but cannot find the language to address it adequately. She hired a full-time chef, She had carefully prepared balanced meals made available to her son. The plates came back with almost nothing touched. 2 small spoonfuls, a few bites, then pushed away. Michael had begun fasting 1 full day each week for religious reasons. But his version of fasting was not rest. In the privacy of his bedroom, he had installed a portable dance floor. On fasting days, he would unroll it and dance for hours, pushing a body that had taken in almost no calories through the kind of physical exertion that professional athletes spend carefully managed nutritional programs supporting. By late 1982, as Thriller rehearsals intensified, his weight had dropped dramatically. The boy who had eaten fried chicken in the back of touring cars was now approximately 120 pounds. The once soft features of his face had become angular and sharp. He looked the way he had decided he needed to look. The people closest to him were not sure whether to call it discipline or something more frightening. The Victory Tour in 1984 brought the warning signs into territory that could no longer be ignored. The physical demands of a major tour are substantial, even for a performer in optimal health. For Michael, at 120 pounds, they were extreme. He was losing 8 to 10 pounds per performance, according to his longtime dresser, Michael Bush, who had to keep multiple pairs of pants in different waist sizes backstage because Michael's weight was dropping in real time across a single show. The sweat alone from the dancing was depleting him at a rate that his minimal intake could not compensate for. He complained of dizziness, of exhaustion that went beyond normal touring fatigue. He was unsteady at times in ways that alarmed the people responsible for keeping him on stage and off a stretcher. The whispers inside his circle about anorexia nervosa began during this period. Katherine Jackson would later describe his attitude toward food with words that carried the grief of a mother who had watched something go irreversibly wrong. If he didn't eat to live, he would never eat. The situation became acute enough that a Brazilian chef named Remy Villarreal received what she later described as one of the most surreal phone calls of her life. She was cleaning her apartment when the caller told her to look out her window at the limousine waiting outside and get in it immediately. She protested that she was in cleaning clothes and needed to change. The caller said there was no time. She was driven to a Beverly Hills penthouse where someone handed her a plane ticket and explained that Michael Jackson was in severe pain from stomach problems caused by his restrictive eating and was refusing to perform until she arrived as his personal chef. The tour was losing money every day. He refused to go on stage. His body had begun rebelling against what he was doing to it. The stomach problems were real, and they were the direct consequence of asking a digestive system to function on almost nothing, while demanding that it support performances that would have been physically demanding for someone consuming 3 times the calories. On stage, he was still Michael Jackson. The moonwalk, the spins, the vocal precision, the emotional connection with audiences that no one else in the world could replicate. But behind the stage, he was dizzy and weak and in pain. The superhuman image and the biological reality had never been further apart. The 1993 allegations changed everything in a way that the touring pressure had not. What the Victory Tour had done physically to his relationship with food, the accusations did psychologically. The media storm that followed the allegations was total and relentless, and specifically targeted at the aspects of Michael Jackson that were most vulnerable. His appearance, his character, his relationship with children, his private life. Everything that he had protected and controlled with such fierce discipline was now being examined and questioned and often misrepresented by people with enormous platforms and no accountability for accuracy. He stopped eating. Not reduced his eating, stopped. His body became something he was no longer managing. In the weeks following the initial allegations, he lost approximately 10 pounds in a body that had almost no pounds to spare. Elizabeth Taylor, who was one of the few people in the world who understood what it felt like to be that specific kind of famous at that specific kind of young age, stepped in with the directness of someone who did not have the luxury of being gentle about it. She literally took a spoon and fed him, by his own account. There were moments during that period when he lost consciousness, when he had to be fed intravenously because his body was no longer receiving adequate nutrition through any other means. The stress had done something that decades of voluntary restriction had not quite managed. It had removed the last remaining functional relationship between hunger and eating. His body was communicating its needs, and he was not receiving the signal. The years between 1993 and the 2005 trial were a series of recoveries and relapses that the public never fully saw because they were happening behind doors that the cameras could not open. He would stabilize. He would perform. He would go through periods where those around him felt cautiously optimistic that the worst was behind them. Then another crisis would arrive, and the eating would collapse again, and the weight would drop to levels that frightened everyone who saw him without the performance lighting and the carefully managed presentation. By the time the 2005 trial began, his weight had dropped below 100 pounds. Below 100 pounds, at 5 feet 9 inches. Nutritionist Dick Gregory, who was brought in by the Jackson family to try to address what they were watching, described him during the trial as being like a zombie. someone who had almost no appetite, who would return to Neverland after long days in the courtroom and simply collapse. Gregory and the family had to actively encourage him to eat small amounts just to maintain the most basic physiological function. The man the cameras followed into the courthouse each morning was operating on almost nothing. The courtroom images from that trial circulated around the world, and the commentary they generated focused almost entirely on his appearance and what it supposedly revealed about his guilt or innocence or mental state. Almost none of it acknowledged what was actually visible in those images, which was a human being in the later stages of a decades-long eating disorder that had been intensifying under the pressure of the most stressful circumstances of his life. He was acquitted on all counts, and the recovery that followed was real, if incomplete. There were years between 2005 and 2009 when those who saw him privately reported that he seemed better, more present, more nourished, more stable than he had been during the trial period. The relationship with his children, which he described repeatedly as the most important thing in his life, appeared to provide a kind of grounding that performance alone had never quite managed. But the "This Is It" announcement changed the calculation. 50 concerts at the O2 Arena in London, the most ambitious comeback in the history of live music, announced to a level of global anticipation that placed an immediate and enormous weight on a man whose body had spent 30 years communicating that it could not sustain this kind of weight indefinitely. Trainer Lou Ferrigno, who worked with him during the rehearsal period for This Is It, spoke about what he observed with a straightforwardness that made the situation impossible to minimize. He only ate once a day. Ferrigno said it had become a running joke among the people around Michael that they needed to put meat on his bones. The joke was the way people who are frightened by something they cannot change sometimes cope with it. But the underlying reality it was covering was not funny. A man rehearsing full concert choreography for several hours a day was eating one meal, sometimes less. The stress of the comeback was compounding everything. The financial pressure was real. The contractual pressure was real. The expectation from the promoters and from the public and from everyone who had invested in This Is It was enormous. And Michael Jackson's response to enormous pressure had been established across decades of consistent behavior. He stopped eating. By the final weeks of rehearsals, the people working with him daily were deeply worried. Not the kind of worried that people express when they want to seem concerned in retrospect. The kind of worried that produces specific conversations and specific attempts to intervene in specific moments where someone decides they need to say something directly and then watches the person that they are concerned about redirect the conversation. The autopsy conducted after his death on June 25, 2009, documented what those weeks of worry had been pointing toward. 136 pounds, 5 feet, 9 inches. Stomach completely empty except for partially dissolved medication. The official language of the report is clinical and precise, and it describes a body that had been severely compromised by chronic malnutrition long before the specific events of that final night. Dr. Conrad Murray, who has been so thoroughly discussed in the context of propofol administration that his observations about Michael's nutrition receive almost no attention described in court testimony, how little Michael was eating in the months before his death. The combination of powerful sedatives and almost no solid food had created a physiological environment in which his organs were functioning at significantly reduced capacity. His heart, his liver, his immune system. All of them weakened by decades of restriction and chronically inadequate nutrition and the specific additional depletion of the This Is It rehearsal period. Medical experts who reviewed the autopsy in the years following his death have been consistent in one assessment that does not appear prominently enough in the public understanding of how he died. Chronic malnutrition was a significant contributing factor, not a footnote, a factor. His body was already compromised before June 25th in ways that had nothing to do with propofol and everything to do with what he had been doing to himself across 4 decades of performing. The question that sits underneath all of this, and that most coverage of his life and death never adequately addresses, is why. Not in the simple sense of why did he stop eating, which has an obvious answer in the pressures and traumas and impossible standards his career imposed on him, but in the deeper sense of what it means for a human being to develop a relationship with their own body that becomes so adversarial and so entrenched that even the clearest biological signals cannot reach through it. He said it himself in the clearest possible terms more than once. I don't eat to live. I live to perform. That sentence is usually quoted as evidence of his extraordinary dedication to his art, which it is, but it is also a clinical description of a man for whom the normal relationship between nutrition and existence had been completely severed. Eating was not something his body required. It was something that interfered with what his body was for. The stage had become more real to him than his own hunger, more demanding, more urgent, more connected to whatever he understood his purpose to be. The body existed to serve the performance. Its own needs were subordinate to that service, and when the performance was at its highest level of demand, the body's needs became not just subordinate, but essentially irrelevant. He said something else in 2001 that deserves to be heard as clearly as his more famous statements about music and performance. While discussing a potential tour, he told executives directly, "I can't tour anymore. It will kill me." He described how the preparation for performances caused him to stop eating, stop drinking, stop sleeping. He used the word kill without drama or self-pity as a factual description of what he understood the process of being Michael Jackson on tour to do to his physical body. He was right. He was simply describing an 8-year timeline rather than an immediate one. The image that persists from the outside of his life is the performance. The moonwalk. The Jackson 5 footage of a child with more raw charisma than anyone had ever seen in someone that young. The Thriller video, the halftime show, the one glove and the fedora and the moves that people who saw them live still cannot fully describe, because the description always falls short of the experience. But the image that the autopsy report preserves is different. It is the image of a stomach that was empty, of a body that weighed 136 pounds after a lifetime of giving everything it had to the stage and receiving almost nothing back in the form of basic nourishment, of a man who had told the world and apparently himself that he did not eat to live. The story of Michael Jackson's body is not a story that can be told through the music alone or through the scandals alone or through the specific circumstances of a single night in June 2009. It is a story that stretches from a boy in Gary, Indiana, eating fried chicken in a touring car, to a man on an autopsy table in Los Angeles whose stomach contained nothing except medication. 4 decades of one of the most extraordinary performing careers in human history. 4 decades of a body being asked to do things that bodies are not designed to sustain indefinitely. And 4 decades of a relationship with food that began with joy and simplicity and ended with almost total disconnection from the most basic act of staying alive. The performance was magnificent. The cost was everything. And the empty stomach on the autopsy table was not a footnote or a detail or a medical observation that exists separately from the music and the dancing and the records and the legacy. It was the receipt, the final accounting of what it cost to be that specific kind of extraordinary for that specific amount of time with that specific relationship to a body that was never allowed to be simply a body, that was always required to be something more, something perfect, something that the stage demanded and the lights revealed and the world consumed without ever fully understanding what it was consuming. He gave the world everything he had, including finally the most basic thing of all. The world is still not entirely sure what to do with that truth.